Jesus is one of the most debated figures in human history. And yet, when you actually step into the ancient record, one thing becomes surprisingly clear. The question isn't whether Jesus existed. The real question is what you do with him once you realize he did. In this video, we're going to do something rare. We're going to separate wishful thinking from historical evidence. Without turning this into a dry classroom lecture, we'll look at what the earliest Christian documents actually are. We'll step outside the Bible into non-Christian historians. And we'll end where history can't go. The place where the heart is confronted and changed. Evidence, history, then the deeper question. A lot of people assume Jesus is just a figure of faith, a spiritual symbol, a myth you inherit because your family did. But Christianity didn't begin as an inspirational idea. It began as a claim. Not be a better person. Not wake up to your potential. But something happened. In real time. In a real place. In the shadow of an empire that kept records, enforced laws, collected taxes, and executed rebels. And the first Christians didn't go around saying, "We've discovered a new philosophy." They went around saying, "God has acted in history." That's why this question matters. Because if Jesus never existed, then Christianity collapses into poetry. But if Jesus did exist, even before we talk about miracles, then we're dealing with something different than legend. Here's a simple way to feel the difference. When people compare Jesus to mythic gods like Zeus or Thor, they're comparing stories that live in a kind of once upon a time. But the Jesus story is pinned to names and places, rulers, governors, provinces, executions, movements spreading across cities. That kind of anchoring is exactly what historians look for. So tonight we're not asking, do you like Christianity? We're not asking, do you trust churches? We're asking a more basic question. Is there actual historical evidence that Jesus existed? And if the answer is yes, then the deeper question becomes unavoidable. Who was he? Because once a figure steps out of the fog of myth and into history, you can't just file him away as a metaphor anymore. Before we start listing sources, we need to be honest about something that modern people often forget. Ancient history doesn't come with video footage. For most people in antiquity, especially non-elites, there is no paper trail like we expect today. As Bart Ehrman bluntly notes in a mainstream historical overview, we often don't have archaeological records for virtually anyone from that time and place, and lack of archaeology is not unusual for ordinary people. So historians work with what survives. Texts, inscriptions, archaeology, and the external ripples a person leaves behind. And here is the key. Bias does not equal useless. Every ancient author has a perspective. A Roman senator has a perspective. A Jewish historian has a perspective. Early Christians absolutely have a perspective. The question historians ask isn't, is this source neutral? Because almost no ancient source is. The question is, how close is it to the events? Does it show signs of independence from other sources? Does it fit what we know of the time and place? Does it accidentally reveal things the author wouldn't invent? Do hostile or uninterested witnesses confirm the basics? And when multiple streams converge, especially when some of them are not friendly to the movement, that's when historians begin to say, this is historically real. That's the kind of evidential framework we're using here. And with Jesus, something remarkable happens. Even if you bracket off all spiritual claims, you still have multiple early streams pointing to a real person at the center. Now let's start where the evidence is strongest and earliest. The New Testament is not a single book written in one moment. It's a library, letters, narratives, and memoir-like texts produced in the first generations of the movement. And here's the first huge misconception. Most people assume the Gospels were written first. But in one of the most widely used open university-level introductions to the New Testament, Dale B. Martin explains that the earliest surviving Christian writings are actually the letters of Paul the Apostle, and that the Gospels were written later than Paul's letters by 20 or 30 years. That matters because it means Christianity is grounded first in letters, real correspondence, written to real communities, about real claims, while the movement is still young. Paul isn't presented as a direct eyewitness of Jesus' public ministry. So why does Paul matter historically? Because Paul personally knew key early leaders. In Galatians, Paul describes going up to Jerusalem and staying with Cephas, Peter, 15 days, and he specifically mentions seeing James, the Lord's brother. That's not a legend written centuries later. That's an early insider arguing about authority and credibility, and almost in passing, he reveals relationships that are extremely hard to explain if Jesus never existed. So already we have an early stream that assumes Jesus was a real person. He had close followers. He had a brother recognized in the movement. And these people were known within the first generation. Then in First Epistle to the Corinthians, Paul quotes what looks like a tradition he received, and then passed on, centered on death, burial, and appearances. I received, I passed on. That language signals tradition being transmitted, not invented on the spot. Whether you believe the resurrection occurred is a later question. But historically, this tells us something powerful. Very early Christians were proclaiming Jesus as a real, crucified figure, and they believed something happened afterward. Now, what about the four Gospels? The broad critical timeline taught in mainstream academic settings is the earliest Gospel we possess, Gospel of Mark, is commonly dated around the year 70, and Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of Luke come later and make use of Mark as a source. And Gospel of John is typically later still. In that same academic lecture, Martin makes an important point. The Gospels were anonymously published, in the sense that the texts themselves don't contain modern-style title pages naming the author. Now pause, because skeptics often pounce right here. If they're anonymous and written decades later, they're useless. But historians don't think that way. In ancient history, decades is not automatically too late. The real question becomes, what sources and memories are being preserved, and how are they being shaped? And Luke's opening paragraph explicitly claims that the author is compiling earlier testimony and traditions, including what was handed on by eyewitnesses. So the New Testament, even viewed strictly as ancient literature, gives us early letters connected to the first-generation leadership, early proclamation about Jesus, death, and the movement's central claims, and narrative accounts written within a historically plausible window for living memory. But now, this is where credibility gets explosive. Because even if someone says, fine, but that's all Christian, we can step outside the Christian writings into the Roman and Jewish world. And that's where the case becomes very hard to dismiss. Here's what makes this section so important. These sources are not written by Christians. They are not trying to promote Christianity. Some of them actively despise it. And yet, they still confirm the skeleton of the story. A movement called Christians, centered on a figure called Christ, executed under Pontius Pilate, spreading rapidly, worshiping him in extraordinary ways. First, Tacitus. Tacitus is a Roman senator and historian, not sympathetic to Christians. In fact, he describes Christianity as a pernicious superstition, and Christians as a class loathed and punished brutally. And that's why his testimony matters. You don't accidentally strengthen a movement you hate unless you believe the basic facts are already known. In Annals, while discussing Nero's scapegoating of Christians, Tacitus writes that Christus had undergone the death penalty by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus during the reign of Tiberius. That single line gives you a named founder, a named Roman governor, a time anchor, and the fact of execution. And he also confirms something else. By the time of Nero, Christians were already a known group in Rome, and they faced real persecution. Now careful, Tacitus doesn't prove the resurrection. He doesn't tell us what Jesus taught, but he does independently corroborate that. Christians weren't invented centuries later, and their founder wasn't invented either. He treats him as a real executed person. Second, Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian writing for a Greco-Roman audience. He was not a Christian. In Book 20, he refers to the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. That's not preaching. That's identification. Even if you set aside disputed passages, Josephus still anchors Jesus in history through James. Third, Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor writing to Emperor Trajan. He describes Christians gathering before dawn and singing a hymn to Christ as to a god. That's huge. It shows early spread. And it shows Jesus was worshipped, not just remembered. Fourth, Suetonius. He writes about disturbances among Jews at the instigation of Christus. Even if debated, it still supports the broader picture of conflict around the Christ movement. And archaeologically, we even have an inscription confirming Pontius Pilate as prefect of Judea. These names are not myth. They're anchored in real governance. So step back. A Roman historian confirms execution. A Jewish historian references Jesus and his brother. A Roman governor describes worship. A Roman biographer notes disturbances tied to Christ. None of this was written to convert you. It was written because the movement couldn't be ignored. At this point, the debate shifts. Not did Jesus exist, but what can we know about him? What do we do with the claims? Even critics acknowledge that the vast majority of historians accept Jesus' existence. So what's commonly accepted? Jesus was a real first-century Jewish figure. He had followers. He was executed under Pontius Pilate. His followers believed they encountered him after death. And the movement spread rapidly. This is not fringe. So if someone says Jesus is made up, they now have to explain all of that. And that brings us to something deeper. Something happened that transformed frightened followers into bold witnesses. We shouldn't exaggerate martyrdom claims, but we can say there was real risk, real persecution, real deaths. Tacitus describes brutal punishment. Pliny describes executions. Josephus records James' death. So the question becomes, why didn't this movement collapse? Crucifixion was meant to erase. But instead, communities formed. Worship emerged. The message spread. People refused to renounce Christ. People can die for false beliefs, but they don't usually die for something they know is false. So what did they believe they saw? And now we arrive at the hinge. If Jesus existed and was crucified, what happened after? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul describes an early tradition. Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and appeared to individuals and groups. Historically, this tells us the belief was early. The claims were specific. Does it prove resurrection? It proves the claim. History takes you to the edge. The empty tomb is debated. But regardless, the movement still demands explanation. Some say, the body was stolen. There were visions. It was legend. Christians say, he rose. And here's the shift. Resurrection isn't just historical. It's a claim about reality. And this is where everything changes. Because history can point to Jesus, but history cannot reveal him to you. Because Jesus is not only a figure of the past. The most dangerous claim of Christianity is not, long ago a teacher lived. It is, he is present. The same Christ who walked in history speaks now not as ink on paper, but as living reality. And this brings it inward. In Luke 17:21, the kingdom is described as within you, among you, in your midst. Not only future, not only external, present. So let me ask you something. What if this question is not just intellectual? What if you're not only searching for a fact, but for an encounter? Because history can say, Jesus existed, but the heart asks, does he exist for me? If this opened your eyes, or stirred something deeper in you, consider subscribing, not just for information, but for transformation. And if you're watching this late at night, with that quiet feeling in your chest, remember this. Evidence can bring you to the doorway, but you still choose whether to step through.